Hey, what is up, FunAhead friends and family and friends? Look out for that deer. I hope you're doing exceptionally well today. If you are, please drop a like. If you're not, well, drop a comment. We'll talk about it, you know? I'm not a therapist, but Porsches sure are great therapy, and, you know, we can talk through it together. All right, now, on today's agenda, we're going to be going ahead and swapping out a bad tie rod end on my car. It's the one on the driver's side, or the left side of the car if you're in the US. So we're going to talk first about how to inspect your ball joints. If you're not overly familiar with this process, it's very simple, but we'll just go over that really quickly. And then we'll talk about some tips and tricks that you should know whenever you are swapping out a tie rod end, because of course this can significantly impact your alignment. In fact, tie rod ends are the thing that you adjust when you adjust the toe of your alignment. Here is the part in question. This is the brand new tie rod end that we're going to be installing on the car today. And yes, it is this entire piece. Basically, the only reason that you'd ever have to replace this is because of this ball joint right here having gone bad on your car. Now, in my case, the ball joint hasn't gone completely bad yet, but it will soon. What we did have go bad, however, was the rubber boot. The boot aged and cracked and has basically been letting water and dirt inside the ball joint, which that is basically the primary mode of failure with most ball joints. That boot cracks, and then it's just a matter of time before you get enough dirt and debris inside of that joint to where it rusts and gets all that abrasive dirt in there, and then just causes there to be excessive wear inside of the joint itself. And then it can eventually get so bad where the joint literally pops out. Considering this is what controls your steering, you don't want that ball joint to pop out, especially when you're running a car on track. Bad news. I am going to go over several tips and tricks that you can apply when you're swapping out one of these to avoid having to go get an alignment, and technically you should always go get an alignment anytime you do any amount of suspension work or linkage work, but I've done it many times before where I've swapped out a tie rod end and you can get away with keeping your toe perfectly in the same place that it was and just keep riding into the sunset. Let's go ahead and take a look at the old part real quick. You can see here is the old tie rod end. This is attached directly to the steering rack and controls the steering. Now, that typically the way you do an inspection of any given front wheel to see if any ball joints or bushings are bad or wheel bearings, you would normally have the wheel on the car and you can do a shake on the hub vertically to check for wheel bearing play, and then you do it left to right to check for any amount of tie rod end play. Of course, depending on your suspension geometry, there are certain ways that you're supposed to put weight on the suspension and pry on the suspension to be able to truly detect if there's actual play, primarily referring to lower ball joints, but we're not talking about that today. We're talking about tie rod ends. What's good and bad about this situation is this is a very premature form of failure. And what I mean by that is just the boot has cracked. Hopefully you can see that enough, and they're kind of all around. This rubber has aged quite badly. And of course that has, like I mentioned, let dirt and debris and water inside of that ball joint and caused this ball joint to begin to age. I don't know why I'm pointing here. It's actually the ball joint is in this lower portion. If there's not play, well, just be doubly sure. Put your eyes on every single one of the ball joints and just make sure that none of the boots have any cracks in them. What will eventually happen, like I said, is there will become too much play in that ball joint, and then you'll have slop in the steering, and then what will eventually happen is this ball joint will or could fall out. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started on working on this thing. I think I've talked enough. Okay, now the name of the game with regards to maintaining your alignment is putting everything back in the exact way you found it. Obviously. Basically, you just count the threads of the old one as you're taking it off and then put it on the exact amount of threads when you put the new one on, but that's not always a foolproof way of doing this. There is some, of course, manufacturing variability, and you will get some error in that. As a secondary measure, take something that is telescoping, for example, a magnet, and just find a spot, like a datum point basically, and put it in place. It's hard to do this with one hand. There is the length between the caliper and the hard metal surface of the unibody, and that way we can use this as a reference distance between the caliper and the frame of the car when we go to put all this back together. And that basically means that we've maintained the orientation of the front wheels to one another. Then once you get your length, you can take this back out. This will just be a reference measurement point for the very end. Okay, hopefully you guys can see this okay. Should be able to. But I've gone ahead and already loosened this lock nut As you can see, of course, the whole purpose of this is to prevent the inner tie rod from spinning with regards to the outer tie rod. And of course, these are threaded within one another, and if they thread into each other or out, then they either cause this whole rod to lengthen or shorten, which of course impacts your alignment. So one of the tricks too is, now that we have this lock nut loosened, leave it exactly where it is. Maybe back it off like a 20th of a turn, but we don't need it to move any more inwards, because we want to be able to maintain this relationship as far as from ball joint to inner tie rod end. That's loose. That's kind of step one. Step two, we're going to go ahead and take this nut off of the hub to loosen the ball joint. If we get lucky, we'll be able to spin the ball joint loose instead of having to utilize a pickle fork to separate this, because these are interference fit, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. We're going to go ahead and pop this puppy off. It is an 18 millimeter. Might be hard to tell, but basically the stud on the ball joint is shaped like a cone. So basically, as you draw this up into the hub and tighten it, you're interference fitting this thing, and they oftentimes do not want to come out when you loosen them. So one strategy is you can get a big old hammer and start beating on the top of this thing. You can start beating on this on the hub part to basically loosen it up, put enough vibration through it to where it wants to loosen. Or you can use what's called a pickle fork, which is a big pickle device, a big wedge that goes in here and separates out the ball joint. I'm going to try maybe first just hitting it with a big old hammer. When you do that though, be very, 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 very careful as to not hit the rotor, because if you do, you'll have a nice dent in your rotor, and you will feel and hear that every single time you hit the brakes. You'll either need to have your rotors turned or get a brand new rotor. We did end up having to resort to using the pickle fork. As you can see, basically it's a long rod that has a fork and goes on either end of this. As you can see, it's wedge shaped, and you just take a hammer and drive that puppy in there. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and just start beating on this thing a little bit, and hopefully we can get her separated. All right, well, we've got the ball joint set back up in the hub just temporarily to give a precise location within the hub. That way we can go ahead and get ourselves a new reference point right here. So that's set. I can go ahead and take this out now because we've got our new reference point. Now we can take this out. Good. Move this and have plenty of room to work to get the outer tie rod out. Time to take the tie rod end off. Like I said, we've got our set screw here that is now loose. We don't want to back that off really at all because we want to use that as a reference point. So we're going to just back it off a tiny bit so that we can spin this freely. Of course, make sure as you're spinning this that the inner tie rod is not turning. If it is, well, grab a quick wrench. That's a 13 to be able to hold it still, but in our case we have it freed up and it is not turning. From here we're going to go ahead and count every single turn until this thing comes off so that we can know exactly how many turns to put this thing back on to this inner tie rod. "25 turns. Okay, time to start going back together with our new tie rod end. 25 turns. Boom, and that now with 25 turns butts up perfectly against our locking nut here. New ball joints can be kind of stubborn, so don't be afraid to beat them up a little bit and move them around. Let's shove this in the wheel real quick and make sure that we are in the ballpark. That way we can say that the alignment is still in the exact same orientation it was prior to taking the old one off. All right, our reference point looks to be in the same spot. Now we can go ahead and lock everything down with regards to our new tie rod end and call this job done. Well, everybody, she is all done and completely ready to rip. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and call it here for today. I know this wasn't the most exciting episode of all time. Definitely more on the side of informative as opposed to entertaining, but they can't all be winners, right? That's just how we roll over here at FunAhead TV. Sometimes we have fun, sometimes it's all about being a student. Come to think of it, that's just kind of how life is, I guess. But thank you all so much for tuning into FunAhead TV. I really appreciate all of you being here, each and every one of you. Yes, you, I'm looking right at you. I will hopefully see you all in the next episode. See ya. Oh, hey FunAhead friends and family. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see even more great FunAhead TV content, please click the suggested video right here. I'll see you over there.
Quarterback!